Welcome back to the Takeout. Monday marks 6 years since George Floyd was killed while being pinned down by a police officer in Minneapolis. That death sparked, as you well remember, nationwide outrage, protests, and calls for police reform. Now, the House, in a different Congress, twice passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That remains stalled in the current Congress. Some lawmakers are hoping to change that. One of them is Maryland Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey. Another, from a different point of view, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. Both join me now. Mr. Attorney General, let me start with you, because I wonder from your perspective if what has played out in Minnesota this year with the aggressive federal immigration enforcement has, from your perspective, made even more imperative some of the underlying accountability and reform initiatives within this legislation.
I certainly do agree with that. One of the provisions of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is to prohibit racial profiling and to give us more tools to make sure that the justice system and police enforcement is applied equally and fairly to all citizens. That provision of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would help us out quite a bit. And so one of the things we saw under Operation Metro Surge is just widespread and routinized selection of persons based on ethnicity and perceived background for extra enforcement activity. And that certainly is something that I think this law could help us protect from.
And Mr. Attorney General, how about the very basic issue of if there is a federal law enforcement person involved and there is a perceived or possible crime, the state having access, investigatory access to do its own investigation?
No question, that is fundamental and essential, as I would like you and all your listeners to know. If a federal agent breaks a state criminal law, that state has the right to enforce the law on any person who breaks it, including a federal agent. When some folks said that there was absolute immunity, I can assure you that is absolutely wrong, and it misinforms the officers who are involved, and that's a shame.
Congressman Ivey, I want to bring you into this conversation. What is the atmosphere on Capitol Hill about this? Because President Trump is pretty aggressive about his language, about all the reform conversation after George Floyd. You're weak on crime. You want to defund the police. And the political atmosphere, as I gather it in the Republican conference, both in the House and Senate, as hostile as ever to this underlying legislation.
Yeah, in some ways, that's for sure. And they're also sort of circling the wagons with respect to the ICE agents and Border Patrol agents who clearly broken the law and crossed the line with the use of excessive force. Secretary Noem is no longer secretary. She's the former secretary. The Attorney General, Bondi, who made statements like that, is no longer the Attorney General. So I think that there's been some pushback on that front. They've been replaced by people who aren't a lot better, frankly, but I think it's critical for us to continue to push Democrats here in the House, and I think there's also support for this in the Senate. But one day we'll have a chance to get back in the majority and see if we can move it forward then. But in the meantime, I think it's important to make sure, as Attorney General Ellison was saying, states and localities need to be able to move forward with criminal cases in their own, in their own criminal processes. In these particular cases with the shootings of Ms. Good and Mr. Preddy, the Department of Justice has been essentially obstructing their investigations by withholding critical evidence in those cases. Now they've moved forward, and the Attorney General can talk about this in other cases, but it doesn't make sense for the feds to withhold evidence and allow local prosecutors and local courts to make determinations about how this can go forward. Even if this gets moved to federal court, they should still be able to get the information that they need.
Congressman, I'll ask you this first, and I also want the Attorney General to weigh in on this. It's an adjacent issue, but it's not irrelevant. Yesterday, there was the leaked document, the so-called DNC, Democratic National Committee autopsy. It didn't address crime directly, but it said there is a perception National Democrats have of being unable to communicate strength. Part of that is filtered through public safety, crime. Do you believe that's true? Do you believe that the push for law enforcement reform in any way undercuts the Democratic Party's ability to communicate politically strength? Congressman Ivey, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that's kind of apples and oranges. I mean, a quick autopsy of the 2024 election, I don't recall crime being an issue there really at all. what you ran into was issues about Trump and Biden and the perceptions about President Biden and him not being up to the job. Ultimately, he withdrew. And that only left 107 days for former Vice President Harris to put a campaign together, and there wasn't enough time. Having said that, I think a lot of the Democrats and independents that voted for Trump a couple of years ago have a case of buyer's remorse like you can't imagine. And the economy continues to plummet. Gas prices are going up. Groceries are up. All of the things he said he would fix, he's made worse. And then he said he wouldn't get us in wars. He's done that, which is why the gas prices are going up. So I don't think crime is going to be, I don't think it was a problem for us in 2024, and I don't think it will be in 2026 either.
Mr. Attorney General, I'd like your appraisal.
I think that everybody wants to be safe, and that's a very legitimate thing. I fight for that every day as a prosecutor, attorney general. And I can tell you that there's no question that better relationships between police and community makes for a safer community. When people believe that the police are treating them with fairness and dignity and respect, even if they're being aggressive law enforcers, they get more cooperation. People come forward and they say, officer, I saw something over there. You don't want to create a situation like the one that Derek Chauvin created, where people in the neighborhood don't want to come forward because of the treatment that they saw right in front of their eyes. So I have to disagree that holding officers to high standards, which most police officers want and don't have any problem with, I don't agree that high standards are hostile to police. I think they're only hostile to police who don't want to observe the Constitution. But to officers who put themselves in harm's way every day to protect Americans, they're all right with following the Constitution. I can assure you of that.
Maryland Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey, Minnesota Democratic Attorney General Keith Ellison. Gentlemen, thank you both. I appreciate it.